Noubar Afeyan, thank you very much for joining our course. Please tell us a bit more about yourself and your role as CEO and founder of Flagship Pioneering.
Sure. Well, thanks for inviting me. I've been involved in innovation and entrepreneurship in the life sciences for about 31 years. I did a PhD in what was then a new field, biochemical engineering, and since then have found different ways of deriving value from making breakthroughs in that area. And initially, I followed the kind of traditional route of developing technologies, raising capital, and developing startup companies, venture-backed startup companies. And then more recently, what Flagship Pioneering really specializes in is in a different way of thinking about both innovation and entrepreneurship. And we're looking to systematize the process and make it something that an institution can do instead of a group of individuals.
Great. So tell me first how you got the bug of taking technologies and bringing them to market. What was the spark that got you in this journey?
Different people are inspired by different things. In my case, it was actually quite memorable. I had no intention or no idea in 1985. Graduate students, let alone kind of not from this country, didn't exactly think that they were going to go off and start a company. That's a pretty recent phenomenon in the last 15 years or so. So I was a graduate student working in a pretty esoteric kind of project, and I happened to find myself at an NSF conference that MIT had sent me to. You have to remember, in the 1980s, the U.S. was worried that it was going to lose its competitiveness against Japan, and there were all these kind of meetings about how are we going to compete with Japan, etc. And they must have needed somebody who knew how to spell biotechnology, so they sent me down. And at this conference, which was otherwise utterly boring, I happened at lunch to sit with somebody, and I got enough courage to ask him what he did and who he was and stuff. And he started telling me how he had started a company some 35 years earlier with another friend of his, and they were a new breed of engineer. This was electronic engineer. They came out of the power industry. And I was listening to his story, and it's just kind of I had nothing to relate to. Except when he said new breed of engineer, I kind of thought, well, that's interesting. I'm a new breed of engineer, and engineers had not done biology ever in the past. And he said, they didn't know what these engineers would make, but they knew they would need to measure whatever they made. And so he and this friend of his started this effort to make an oscilloscope in their garage. And they started selling it to their friends. And then that led them to make even more products. And so it's kind of interesting. I had no idea who he was, but it was interesting to relate to. I was a new breed of engineer. We didn't know what biological engineers would make, but we did know that they were going to need to measure things. And so, probably out of a deficiency of fairly linear thinking, as engineers sometimes have, I was just mapping it to me, and I was saying, oh, that's interesting. And then I asked him who he was, and it was David Packard from Hewlett-Packard. And he spent the next couple of hours telling me, just one-on-one, as just, out of, I could have been sitting in a park bench with the guy. I mean, he was literally just very relatable. And literally, I came back to MIT, to my graduate, kind of lab, and then I thought, well, how am I going to figure out how to do this? I really wanted to do this. And I went to Sloan School and said, can I take courses? They had absolutely no courses on entrepreneurship at the time. Now everybody has 1,000 courses, but it was not something that was taught. So that's when I actually started finding my way to Eric von Hippel's class and to several other people's class who were teaching management of technology, innovation. There was a corporate venture capital course I took, I don't know why, all to just kind of get myself introduced to that. And that's kind of how I started.
That's incredible. So David Packard, it was the source of your inspiration.
It was randomly because he was relatable.
Yeah.
It's kind of one of the things I've learned over all these years I've done this is that sometimes people make entrepreneurship some kind of almost like art or science, or there's almost celebrity associated with it, and I always resent that because it makes it unrelatable. It makes it look like when I like playing basketball, but when I look at Michael Jordan, I realize I'm not going to be him.
Yes.
And those kinds of celebrity figures don't encourage the sport. They actually discourage the sport.
Yeah.
I mean, without wanting, because you say, I'm never going to be that.
Yeah.
Well, he was a guy who was clearly a celebrity in doing that, but he was absolutely no different. And what he impressed upon me is that if I was willing to kind of stick with it and iterate and learn and adapt, he didn't give me any other tidbits. There wasn't that much to give. So I think, and since then, part of the reason I teach, and I've taught for the last 17 years, various aspects of entrepreneurship and innovation, is just that. Because I realized the more people realize that this is not some kind of high-browed activity, the better the economy is.
So tell me, from that inspiration to your first startup.
In 1987, which was a couple of years after this meeting, after I had kind of exposed myself a little bit to what innovation and technology was, and without really an idea to start a company around, as I was getting close to graduating, I started thinking, well, I should really keep that as an alternative in mind. I went out and met a startup company that was then just forming out in the West Coast, realized that being employed in one wasn't kind of the same thing for me, because I realized other people were trying to figure out what needed to be done and I was going to execute it. And while that was interesting, that I didn't consider that to be the same thing. And so I started kind of trying to figure out, okay, if I was going to do this, what would I do it with? And pretty linearly, I thought, okay, what about making instruments for the biotech industry? Just like these guys had made instruments for the electronics industry. And started looking at, okay, well, what the needs are. So it's kind of a pretty kind of classical way of thinking about user unmet needs first, which again for a technologist wasn't the first thought they come to mind. But the folks at Sloan had impressed upon me that far more interesting than finding customers for what I could do was finding problems that were worth solving. And so I looked at a bunch of different things where we could apply engineering mindset, problem solving, and there were many because the field is so new. And whenever I always find that if you're working in a field that's rapidly changing, there's an innate advantage that if you're a newcomer, there isn't that much difference between you and the current players because they also haven't been at it that long. So that's how I started. So I basically wrote a business plan as I was graduating from MIT. My first meeting with a venture capitalist was, I think it was something like October 30th or something like that, 29th, I forget the exact date, in 1987, which happened, I remember very well. It was a Tuesday because it was the day right after the stock market crashed. Yeah. So the Monday, the Black Monday that occurred.
That was October 19th.
October 19th. So it was the day 20th. After, October 20th. And I remember having set up a meeting, going to see at the time famous venture capitalist Ginger Moore at Oak Ventures, who in the life sciences area is one of very few people who invested. And I went to see her, and it was kind of quite a stark memory because I was 24 years old and I had the business plan and I didn't know what I was doing. And here was this person who had done this for 20 years already, and she was completely frazzled, lost, kind of devastated at what was going on. And I thought, boy, this is it's a weird introduction to the field. It was the best thing that happened to me because, frankly, 31 years later, even in the last few days, the feeling is quite similar. And so one thing I learned back then is that if you have a calm day, it's actually not out of character, but it's usually just very turbulent. But anyway, and it also tested me because her advice to me was, you look like you can do this, you've got a good idea, but you're never going to be able to raise money for the next year. Go do something else, because the market had been devastated. And it was interesting, and so that forced me to. I didn't take her advice, but at the same time, I did realize it was going to take a while to be able to raise money, and so I started trying to. I got a side job at MIT doing technology licensing for a year. My professor was generous too. They needed somebody to do some licensing work, and I continued to develop the business plan and got a lot of help from Ed Roberts, who's a kind of quite a legendary figure in entrepreneurship. And about, let's say, maybe almost a year later, I ended up getting some seed capital from quite unlikely sources, meaning just random people. I had met 100 different people. I used to think, and this may be useful for your audience, at the time I used to think that if I'm just successful ultimately, I felt like a beggar. I mean, that's kind of what it feels like. I had absolutely nothing. Yeah. I had no technology. I had a piece of paper. I had my background.
Just the idea.
Just the idea. Yeah. There was no proof of concept. There was no technology I was licensing. Nothing. I just I had an idea. I'd filed a patent. And it was closest thing to begging. They have it. You don't. You need it. Yeah. They may not need it as much. And the chance that I'm going to give them anything back is pretty dubious. It's a similar act. And I was telling myself, if you're successful, then you don't have to beg anymore. Yeah. And 31 years later, I realized that if you're successful, you beg for more and more. But that feeling doesn't go away, because anytime you're trying to kind of pre-sell the value promise of innovation that isn't proven, and then eventually realize it and reward people, it's an extreme form of fundraising, and that's kind of what comes with the territory. So I ended up getting some seed capital and started this company, which ended up growing over some period of time. By '89, we raised some venture capital money. This was, again, the old days of where venture capitalists used to put $100,000, $300,000 in, and then at the most $1 million, $2 million in ever. So it was not like there was not seed capital. Seed capital back then was $25,000. So at the end, this company called Perceptive Biosystems ended up raising $11 million from 7 venture capital firms, of which some venerable firms like Venrock and Bessemer and Highland Capital were the big investors, and there were 3i, the Bank of England. I mean, it was crazy that they were all putting in $500,000, $1 million. And ultimately, the company actually took off. In '92, we went public. In '97, we had about $110 million in revenues. We became a very established player and leader in the protein analytical instrument field. And so that was that journey. It was every day was as exhilarating as it was terrifying. Yeah. And now this is a well-trodden road. But back then, I remember very clearly the most recent company that Inc. 500, we were on the Inc. 500 pretty early on, had featured was Lotus.
Yes.
And of course Lotus had subsequently kind of been sold and disbanded, and it was before that it was digital. So it wasn't like there were all that many companies to say I want to do that. Yeah. You had to figure it out yourself.
Yeah, that's an incredible story. So you went through this journey. You have an idea. You incubate the idea. You persist, form a team. You raise capital. You go public. Mm-hmm. Then you're back for more. So it's not one and done for you. This has become a lifetime. This is your. So tell us this transformation. Yeah. So what that was and what caused you to sort of think about this.
Sure. Well, so first I'll go back to the perceptive thing, because one of the things you realize is that I ended up wanting. I mean, I did this largely because I wanted to learn how to do it, as opposed to the rewards of doing it or a lot of other things. I just thought it was so unlikely that I could pick up the minimum needed to be able to succeed minimally, that was a real adventure. So I wasn't a good manager. I'm probably still not a good manager. I didn't know how to raise money. I didn't know how to hire people. I knew even less about how to fire people. Excruciatingly painful to do for the first time. I had hired a bunch of experienced people early on. The one thing I learned that I think is quite kind of ageless in terms of a lesson, I use it to this day, is that especially when you're young and when you're not expected to know much, the fact that you actually use that to ingratiate yourself to people so that they help you in helping you figure out something is a really powerful source of kind of borrowed intellect. I mean, you cannot have wisdom, early on.
Yes.
The next best thing is to admit it and to let other people give you their wisdom. And by this, I don't mean advisors and mentors. I just mean people who just kind of like you and decide that they want to help you succeed. Yes. There's a lot of people out there who, as long as you give them, it's like permission marketing. This is like permission advice. If you give them the permission to give you advice, and they see you use it, not that they go, okay, I'll take that into consideration, but you truly kind of, let go of pretending that you know a lot.
Yeah.
And I didn't have this problem because I literally didn't know a lot about anything. My PhD had nothing to do with what the company did. I knew the language, but not much. I had no connections. I was an immigrant. I came originally from Lebanon, escaped the war, went to Canada, kind of grew up in a foreign place. So I had zero expectations, zero entitlement. I was not even American. I was Canadian. There was a lot of immigration issues back then, of a different kind. It was very hard to get papers here. There was no H-1 visas were like a new thing, and so it's interesting in hindsight when you look at it. But anyway, so that so learning how to manage, how to create business strategy. I never, to this day, I don't quite know what strategy is when it comes to a startup, because you have 100 different things you could do and 100 different ways of doing them, and choosing one, I suppose, is strategy.
Yes. Strategy is about choice.
That's what I mean. It's about choice, but in this case, there's like nothing else. It's a bit of an arbitrary choice in the beginning, uninformed choice, followed by lots of iteration. That's what I've learned. Anyway, but before getting to kind of what I do now, what ended up happening is in 94 or so, this company, I had iterated enough and made enough mistakes that I had a pretty good team. The revenues were growing. We were expanding. And, for the first time, I started realizing that, okay, I kind of sort of get it. And I became interested in innovation and value creation again. And I realized that in this company, which was by that time about 400 people, it's really hard to get rewarded for innovation. Because even though we were little, we were already too big.
You were already focused
for that. We had a line of products, and there's so much more we could have done. So I started actually experimenting with innovating with other people and helping other people start companies. So I was still running this first company, I was CEO of a public company, but I was able to, and when my board knew it and were supportive of it, I was able to get involved in a few other companies where people were, either they had a notion or an idea, but by now I was a little experienced. And so, ironically, they were looking for my experience, and here I was still winging it. And so in the 90s, kind of between 94 and 97, I got involved in about 4 other roles as a co-founder of companies. One was a drug discovery company that I ended up being chairman of, and we raised capital from a number of other venture capitalists to grow a very successful company. It was sold. We started a cancer diagnostics company, started a cancer vaccine company. And I found
this sounds like an addiction. Like you were just starting companies.
So it was interesting. No, I'll tell you, this was interesting. I was not doing it alone. So I had gone from founder to co-founder, and co-founder is a more scalable role than founder. But at the same time, I was not an investor in these things. I hadn't taken any money out of my first company. But I'll tell you why I got interested in this is that at the time the only kind of entrepreneur there was one and done or a serial entrepreneur. And I had thought kind of skeptically around serial entrepreneurship. I didn't know anything, but I always thought, well, why? If you've built a lot of value, what is there to show by doing it again and again and again? A silly thought, but I thought, what about parallel entrepreneurship? And back in the 90s, I used to go around telling people, entrepreneurship should be parallel. It's like parallel chess, where people play simultaneously multiple people. I always thought that's incredibly hard compared to playing one game. It's hard enough to play one. Yeah. And I must say that actually was just a kind of a hypothesis that led to what I do now, because as I tried to do that, I realized that when you're doing something in parallel, that isn't as defined as, let's say, calculus or something. It's not a discipline yet. It forces you to focus on the essence of what you're doing and not all the idiosyncrasies of every single case. So I started kind of forcibly to say, okay, what can I do if I'm spending a few hours a week on a project that in and of itself wants to change the world, but my role in it, my involvement in it has to be strategic, surgical, highly leveraged, but not, infinite involvement of time, which is what you do when you're doing one company. Yeah. And so those experiences kind of in the end, the first company went public and it was sold 5 years later. The 3 of the other companies went public. 2 of them were sold, and this is now in 97, 98. And eventually I kind of started getting more intrigued by parallel entrepreneurship, and I thought I would devote myself to now going the next step, which is to say, why don't we if you can do this in parallel, why not do this institutionally? Because the next step there is it a solo game or is it a team game? And that's kind of what led to the thinking that led to Flagship.
So tell us what Flagship does.
Yeah, so that's Flagship. Flagship is first and foremost a life science innovation company. We have our own way by which we innovate, which I'll tell you about. Yeah. Once we come up with something that's worth taking forward, we form a company to take that forward. And so we also had to figure out how to do venture creation in a systematic way. We have our own capital, then we deploy into these companies to help them grow for the first 2-3 years. So up until then, they operate as wholly owned pieces of Flagship. And then we spin them out. And we spin them out, and for the first time, additional capital comes in. But by that time, the culture, the senior leadership team, the early proof of concept, the early kind of customer or partner traction is there. And it looks like a company ready to eventually live its life on its own. So we're not interested in building kind of subsidiaries open-endedly. Every single thing we do ends up becoming a company or nothing. But so we've become kind of a creator of companies around internal innovations. Now, sometimes these innovations draw from external science, and I can describe that. But we're not only trying to find science and then find what to do with it and create companies. That's become in vogue the last few years. We've been doing this for 18 years. But we've ended up in a place where we think the sustainable way to do this is to have your own innovation capacity, your own company creation capacity, initial growth, and then the companies have the wherewithal to grow and compete and thrive.
That's fascinating. So walk us through one example of a company that you guys have given birth to from the start to, it's leaving the Flagship fold.
There are many. I think we've been involved in doing about 50 of these that are based on internally developed science, and there's a whole bunch more that also include external. But I'd say one of the internally developed ones that just recently went public, I can give as an example, is Moderna. Yeah. So Moderna was, and I'll tell you kind of this, we have this fairly, let's say, prescribed process, which the way people think about entrepreneurship and innovation, especially breakthrough innovation, is that it is unruly, it is chaotic, it is inspired. And
serendipity.
In my view, it's none of those things.
It's none of those
Absolutely none of those things. I have a completely contrarian view of that, and I've done it enough times in enough different fields that I think, frankly, just to be a little controversial, I think that's an illusion. In other words, I think that because people haven't done that thing before, it's exciting and unexpected to them.
Yes.
But actually, pretty quickly, it looks like just another version of what came before them, because the historians come and say, well, before there was the iPad, there was the iPod, and before that there was the Walkman, etc. And all of a sudden, when you look at it that way, you go, well, why were you surprised?
Yes.
And that's when you realize that these things are just evolving. And so I'll give you an example in this company called Moderna, but before that I'll tell you that underlying how we think you can do this systematically is the notion that breakthroughs aren't made by people, they emerge. And the most understood, not well understood, but understood version of emergence that we know about is evolution, which is that if you do variation, iteration, selection and iteration systematically, the winners will emerge, and when they do, they will look surprising, but actually they're the result of that process. They're not some inspired thought that has nothing to do with that process. So hold that thought as I give examples. There'll all be examples of that, and that actually does cause one to think differently about being possessive about all these companies and all these innovations. We're not. We don't go around saying we invented this. We may file a patent and get an invention, but where these ideas come from are very emergent. So in Moderna's case, talking about emergence, we understood by following the various scientific advances that people were playing around with converting fibroblast cells into what's called induced pluripotent stem cells. These are, somebody won a Nobel Prize recently for this. These are called Yamanaka factors. So it turns out that if you take differentiated cells and you introduce a couple, 3 different proteins, 4 of them specifically, these cells can de-differentiate and look like what came before them, stem cells. They're not normal stem cells, but they're close to being stem cells. And so why do that? Because then you can differentiate it and make other cells. So that was the general field. And in that field, there had been some people, particularly at UPenn and then more recently at Children's Hospital here in Boston, who had been playing around with using what's called mRNA, messenger RNA, to use these to go into cells and express these proteins. Why had they done that? Because it turns out this mRNA, they could actually get a better transformation of these cells. And so we were aware of this work. And we started asking kind of just what-if questions.
So your team is reading scientific papers, is in the air.
Yeah, in this case, exactly. And we do this all the time. So basically
you're in the mix of this flow of knowledge.
Exactly. It's not about reading papers for us as much as just, we are talking to lots of people about lots of different things. And then or somebody says, hey, by the way, I just saw this data. And then we actually read papers in hindsight. In other words, we read papers once we have an idea of what to do, as opposed to read papers to get an idea per se, because there's, the signal to noise in papers is gigantic. You can't, if you sit there and read 1,000 papers and that gives you 3 ideas, hard to do anything else. So I'm sure that can be done too, but that's not the way we approach it. Anyway, so long story short, we started wondering, for lots of reasons that I can't almost reproduce because you'd have to go back to 2010 in the summer and whatever else was being thought of at the time. So understand, by that time we had about 20 people that were doing this type of activity in various combinations for a living.
Yeah.
And so that's it's important because these ideas kind of get mixed and moved around. This is not a one person thinking deeply is not going to get there. So we started asking, can you think about, we started, why isn't there no drug that is based on mRNA? Now, if you go back 10 years, drugs were made out of proteins and small molecules. There had been an effort to use viruses to introduce genes into the body called gene therapy, and a person had died early on, and that whole field was shut down. And there really was no other variation to proteins and small molecules. And there had been some efforts to try to make, not to get too detailed, but other small DNA, RNA molecules, antisense, what's called, and we were aware of all this, but we were saying, why don't people actually use this microRNA molecule? And that's just a thought experiment, and you can go and answer that question.
So you raise the problem.
You raise a what-if problem. You don't say, initially, we don't start with, we need to cure melanoma. We don't start the problem, what good is this mRNA that can transform cells, because it's not good for anything other than that. Yeah. But we kind of abstracted and said, is there a combination of a solution and a problem that we can identify simultaneously around this space? And if there isn't one, then we move on. And in this case, that's part of our methodology. In this case, what we concluded was that people had tried and failed 10 years earlier. We understood why they tried and failed. We realized that there was no obvious fix to it, but there was a directional fix in that you could modify chemically some of these RNA molecules, and they at least hinted that if you kept doing that, there may be better ways. We had no proof. There was no academic literature that said this can be done. Now, we could have waited for that, but we probably would have been 5-6 years, because now there is academic papers from which we could have started companies. Sure. But our whole thing is to almost mine this, science of the future to try to solve problems of today versus mind the science of today to solve problems of the future. And that is exactly backwards. Yeah. And it's not any better. It's just that you look at the world differently. So publications give you evidence for what you want to do, but that's not why they published those things. They were thinking of a very different thing.
Problem, yeah.
Do you know what I'm saying? So in that regard, that's a little bit. So in Moderna's case, we identified. Well, the other thing that we do, a very integral part of what we do, is that we don't do this in a vacuum. So we go out and talk to people about our hypotheses. These are not science.
And you're not afraid of people taking your ideas?
No, and I'll tell you why. So we have this. So we use, in order to try to create an evolution. So we're trying to create an evolutionary environment. How do you do that? The scientific method uses hypotheses and experimentation. Yes. So we actually do the same thing. We create value hypotheses. We basically say, I will take an mRNA molecule, formulate it with this agent, stick it into muscle, use muscle to... None of it is true. None of it has been done before. But it's just a starting point. We then go with that to a handful of folks that are both experts and non-experts in the field. Super important thing if you're going to practice this kind of work is that experts actually are not the people who are going to give you an idea of how to do things dramatically differently, because they became experts by already doing something dramatically differently, and now they're defending their territory. Yeah. So if you go to talk to somebody and say, can this be done out here? Most people we talk to, they can tell you precisely why it can't be done, which is really valuable from a selection pressure standpoint, but not the source of kind of, and here's a completely different way. So other people, though, who don't have expertise but have interesting creativity, so what we do is we take our hypotheses, and it's never one, because one of the things we've learned is that if you start with one starting point, you only locally search the space around it. So we sample multiple different points. So it might be, how about mRNA as a way to make more proteins in a fermenter? How about, so around the theme, we come up with totally different value pools we try to identify. And then we put a starting point, and then we start talking. And what's been interesting and a great learning exercise over the years that we've seen is that if you go to somebody with a bad idea, but you actually present it in a precise way, they will tell you why it's a bad idea. And in that transaction, something happens, they feel smarter, and you get selection pressure.
Yes.
And so the way our process works is that we actually do this with multiple people. So when you said, aren't you afraid they're going to take your idea? What are they taking? We just made it up.
Yes.
There's zero fact to it.
Yes.
Literally zero fact.
You're just imagining it.
Exactly. We're just a hypothesis, and they know it.
Yes.
Because then they tell us, what proof do you have? I say none.
Yeah.
So then they still engage because it's almost, when we talk to these folks, and this is what we're known for, we create a bit of an expert-free zone in the sense that look, these scientists, here we are at Harvard and MIT, Stanford, these people go to the meetings of their fields, and they cannot say something that does not seem unbelievably smart and reasonable. Actually, I'll make the point, let me caveat. Reasonableness, in my view, is like the gravitational force that keeps innovation from happening. Because people enforce reasonableness in the scientific world on what you are allowed to say. You go publish something in literature that's not reasonable to the reviewers, you can't publish
You
it.
get killed.
So
I've done a whole study on that.
Right.
Yes.
So ask yourself the question, why is it that we think that the only innovations worth working on start their life reasonably? In fact, I can show you many innovations that are now accepted as real transformative things. Every one of them started life unreasonably. And yet, we go look for them in reasonable places by reasonable people who are using reasonableness filters to kill them. So because we knew that, this was not the first thing I had done, we kind of say, look, let's forget reasonableness for a second, just think with us, and they tell us, bad idea, somebody in Japan had tried it, the experiment won't work, and we keep tweaking and tweaking and tweaking. This is different than kind of like you hear a lot in Silicon Valley speak, kind of pivoting. This is not pivoting. Evolution is the master pivot. It's like non-stop pivoting, right? There's nothing to pivot from and to. You're just adapting and surviving. So that mindset is super important. Now, what happens is over time, things emerge, or they don't, but they emerge where the next person you talk to goes, they can't find fault with it. You know that because it frustrates them.
Yeah.
And then they start telling you, well, do you have any proof? And you go, no, I just made this up. It's just that we've been iterating. And then that point is when we go into a lab for the first time. And then and only then do we test the idea. Now, you can't test it fully. You can't test it where, because it takes years and years. But we try to, and one of the expertise we've developed over the years is how to figure out what to test first. And this in life science, you can't use these words, killer experiment, because, life science you can kill. But you want to do the killer experiment early.
Yes.
And so figuring out what's the killer experiment, or 2 or 3 or 4, that if it doesn't fail, allows you to go forward, that's the trick. And we do that in our shop. So in Moderna's case, we spent $2 million, about 6 months, doing a set of key things, but for which we would not have proceeded. So we knew the idea had morphed and evolved and it had some resilience to it. Yeah. We went into labs and asked specific questions. Once we saw that actually some of the things we were hypothesizing could be done, partially, we then decided, okay, let's form the best economic value creation engine known to mankind, which is a startup, in my view. I'm biased. And then we deploy that startup to go after that value pool in as many different ways as we can. So that's kind of both Moderna and the process. Yes. So in 2010 summer, we did what we call an exploration. What we tend to start these things. We have our own kind of terminology. We don't start companies. One of the things I had learned throughout the 90s is that companies are kind of almost immortal. Once you start them, it's hard to kill them. Yeah. So we thought, instead of fighting that, just don't start a company. Yeah. So we start these things we call proto-companies. Yes. They're prototypes. Yes. And we don't name them, we number them. Yes. We don't give people titles. Yes. And it's like a project, except it's a proto-company. It wants to be, just like a prototype product, it wants to be a product, but you can beat it up, you can kill it, you can loan it, whatever. That's how we work, and we've numbered them. We're now at, we've probably done about 100 of these over time, but I think we're on number 65 because we reset these every few years. And so Moderna became, I think it was, 24 was the number it had, or 18, I forget which one it was. And then in 2011, we went into labs. And about 6 months later, we started realizing the data was functional. We brought in, at the time, a very early stage, at the early stage of the company, a CEO. Usually, we get a CEO much later. Happened to be that I knew someone who had kind of really interesting experience, not in doing this, because a lot of our CEOs have not done this before. Yeah. So we experiment with people who have kind of more the personality, and we can talk about it if you like. But and 2012 on, the company's grown as a standalone company and reached certain heights. And now today it has 21 clinical programs of different drugs that it's trying to develop, about 12 that have gone into humans. and it's about 700-person company.
Yeah, and you had just had an IPO as well.
We just did an IPO.
Yeah.
Yes, it's been private for quite a while.
Yeah.
But yeah, and this, what I just described to you is the case, similar case in a company called Rubius that figured out how to take red blood cells and make therapeutics out of them, which nobody academically had proposed as a therapeutic. People were playing with red blood cells. Again, one of the things about it is that academic science for us is an incredibly important substrate that we recompose in order to do this type of science versus, so I'll tell you that the stark contrast, again, they both work, but is that science, the way science is usually done is money goes in to expand the boundaries. Depending on how much money any one place in the boundary gets, how hard that terrain is, and how insistent the person is, that defines how quickly that piece expands. And over time, as this expands, some value opportunities come along, and then entrepreneurs, otherwise known as opportunists, in the better sense of the word, positive sense of the word that I use, find places where value can be created, and they start companies. So there's this adjacency-oriented value creation that is science leading to innovation, leading to products and value. In our case, we start with the kind of let's say foreseeing potential value, totally hypothetical, finding the appropriate science from which we could somehow link to that product, and then figuring out whether you can get there from here, and that allows us to try things that look as an illusion completely surprising, but actually follows a method.
Process. Can you give us an example of, so you described Moderna as an internally developed idea. You've done a few that were externally sourced. Can you walk us through a journey like that where where you saw something and then
right. And so in that case, I mean, there's several I can give you, but a very recent one that we've been working on is a company that's today called Foghorn, but started its life as a academic project where Jerry Crabtree and Sigal Kadosh, who are experts in the field of the biochemistry of chromatin remodeling and the protein complex that it takes to actually that governs aspects of regulating expression of genes. They had made some findings around that complex, very, very precise biochemistry and molecular biology that had led to some interesting findings of things that could be drugged and targets. Early in the field, a lot more work to do, but clearly we could associate with some diseases. By the time one of these things gets to a place where there's already a whole kind of infrastructure put around it, then you really just need capital. I mean, you need capital with experience, but you need capital. In this case, what to do and how to do it and in what sequence to do it and who to do it with, all of that is an open-ended thing. It's really more suggestive science. That's the closest we get to doing things externally is that. And in this case, we worked with them to come up first, without licensing the technology or anything, we first worked on, is this even worth something? So we did an exploration that was inspired by that starting point versus a completely hypothetical starting point. Still very poorly defined. Still followed coming up with some value hypotheses, engaging different discussions, iterating around what's the version of this worth creating. And then we formed a proto company, tested, did some more experiments. Now, in this case, there were experiments we could piggyback off of, but they were, as you know, fully half of academic experiments cannot be reproduced and do not when they're taken out. Nothing wrong with that, but we have to test it. And so we did that, and we could see that this was a really fertile space. We attracted a team. Some of our team went in the beginning, and then we attracted a team, and now that company is emerging. It's probably a year plus away from having a clinical candidate to go into test, but it's becoming known as a real pioneer in that field of biology.
So in this process you described, evolutionary process, both for Foghorn and for Moderna, and the general process, you're sort of out there doing this hypothesis testing. How do you step away from confirmation bias? Right, which is how do you stop yourselves from not fooling?
A lot of ways. A very good point. So first of all, scale. We do 100 explorations a year. So why is that important? Because if we did 2, we'd have a lot of bias. But we are drowning in things we could do. Again, and if we open the aperture to include external things, it'd be 1,000. So that's not the rate limiting step, what things to work on or not. Second, we've carefully designed both the team we have and the way we reward the players such that they're constantly trying to figure out how quickly they could kill an idea so they could work on a better one, which is the exact opposite of what happens in solo entrepreneurship, where if you kill the idea, you're unemployed. Yeah. And while you might have another idea to work on, you start from scratch. So in this protocol phase, we have many more protocols than we could prosecute. So out of the 100, maybe 10 or 15, not the best 10 or 15, by the way, an absolutely arbitrary 10 or 15. I mean, it's best based on the fit between the people who are working on it, but it's not like we don't have any kind of filtering process. Yeah. We do these explorations. We have 5 distinct teams, each about 10 people, all PhDs, MDs, all of whom have grown up within our infrastructure, that in teams of 2 or 3 do these explorations, propose proto companies. Then a handful of them get taken into proto company phase. Each one gets $1 million to $2 million. And then they do this, they run the gauntlet of proving it wrong. One way you get no confirmation bias is that everybody knows that if they're working on this, they're not working on the next Moderna or the next Rubius. Or next. So it's not perfect. Yes. And of course, there's the third element is that people like me and many others now who have done this for 15, 20 years in the Flagship context, we're 18 years old now, are there to kind of keep reminding people that they should question themselves. I mean, one of the things I, kind of deduced, everybody who does this long enough comes up with their own kind of words to say similar things. In my case, the mindset that I think saves you from this kind of bias as much as possible is that of a paranoid optimist. And so I've, for a long time, tried to get across this notion that if you're going to be in this space, if you're a paranoid optimist, by that I mean you're not so optimistic that you actually get reckless, but you're not so paranoid that you get depressed. And this constantly questioning whether it really will work or how big it will be or whether you should be doing something else, that doubt, doubtful optimism, which is really a tortured state to be in, is perfect for evolution. Makes you poised. It makes you constantly say, but can I do it better? Can I do it differently? Who else is doing it? And so that is a fourth way maybe of protecting against the bias, is that, we could not believe in what we're saying long enough because the doubt constantly kicks in. Yeah. And then we don't stay doubtful long enough that we don't actually take some risk. So it's really it's like a gas pedal and a brake pedal. Yeah. You don't want to press them at the same time, but if you toggle between them and you've got a steering wheel, at least simplistically, I think you can go places.
Yeah. For the people taking our course, they won't have access to Flagship. They'll be around the world. They'll have access to some technology, and they'll have to sort of develop these value hypotheses. What advice would you give them? So they're come across something from our course or something in their own companies or in the labs near the universities near them. And what advice would you give them in terms of how to follow your process on their own?
Of course. No, and in fact, I think they can. I think some of what we do has to do with the institution, but a lot of what we do is a mindset and a methodology, and that is not dependent on the institution. Yeah. So I'd say first and foremost, everything I'm saying has to do with science-based companies, because there's a lot of other companies that are market-based and product iteration-based and execution-based that a lot of this stuff is maybe overkill for.
Yeah, I don't think there'll be any apps in our.
So science-based company, I'd say a few things. One, you've got to ask yourself whether you really believe that the solution should emerge versus the solution should be asserted and that you just have to go look for an application. I believe that if you really think rigorously, you may have a technology for which you try to find a problem worth solving, but then that problem may be better solved with something else, which you might also be able to go get, which might lead you to another problem. And those iteration loops might get you a lot more of a valuable place than just saying, I'm a matchmaker. This technology, this application, I'm done. So first is, if you really want to dedicate the next 5-10 years of your life, which in life science is a short time frame, in the tech world it's like 2 years, it works, doesn't work, you're out. So that's one thing, is I'd say, think about your own version of an emergent process. And don't prematurely stop variation, stop selection. And by the way, don't also just outsource selection to investors. Because if you're an entrepreneur and you say, I will come up with the solution and then let's see what they'll invest in, you'll be optimizing for investability, not for what's worth building, what's going to make the biggest reward for you or society, what's impactful. It'll purely be custom made to those days' investors.
Yeah.
And the more the investor, and by the way, the reason people get frustrated is that every investor is looking for a different thing, and so they think it's noise. Yes. And they can't get selection pressure out of it. I think that's a good thing. They should themselves get selection pressure from customers, from people who are going to actually prescribe the medicine, or patients, or a combination of things. So that's one set of things. I think that the second thing that this mindset gives you is, and we haven't talked about this, so let me just bring that out, is that every one of these kind of company ideas, big breakthroughs, it could be technology out of labs. And by the way, I think it's a perfectly good starting point. You want to think about it in its ultimate embodiment as possibly many, many different companies, right? So a seed that can give rise to, think of almost a fertilized egg. That is an omnipotent cell when it comes to differentiation. It could make liver cells, it could make cardiac cells, it could make immune cells. It can go many different ways. So if you think about all those ways, right? If you think about all those ways, then you have to ask yourself, how long can I keep optionality even while I'm building value? Because if you just sit there and go, oh my God, I could be anything, you don't do anything. But the question becomes, if I have direction A that locks me into becoming a skin cell and that's it, I'm done, or a cell that can still maintain optionality, if you're in a brand new space, you really want to first up front think about all the different versions of a Moderna that could be created. And not, maybe you can't build the biggest version on day one, but choices you make that preserve the biggest version, keeps it alive for the longest time, probably the best way to make decisions. Very hard otherwise. Nobody, everybody who succeeds tells the story as though it was strategically thoughtful. The reality is, I know, and everybody who tells the truth knows that these companies are the result of a whole lot of accidental decisions and some thoughtful decisions. So I just think you also want to be cynical about thinking that thoughtfulness and reasonableness and advice is going to get you the answer. Really, you just want to keep optionality.
So, and the thing what you said was so interesting to me was this notion that you start with technology, you find a problem, but then you might find a related problem, and then you might find something even bigger, and you might find a different technology. Exactly. So it's this sort of this journey. So like these technologies that we give to our students are almost like starting points.
Absolutely.
Right. So starting point for the evolutionary process to kick in.
I think so. And again, it could be frustrating, to be honest with you, because if you're,
there's a lot of dead bodies in evolution.
Well, that's true. That's true. That's absolutely. And so, but I think if you say I don't like the odds of evolution, therefore I'd rather, subject myself to a pure dead filter. Dead filter is kind of something. Filter basically is you put a bunch of things and whatever gets through gets through. Evolution, there is no filter. It's a selection process. It's dynamic. But either way, there's going to be a selection of some sort. Yes. I would argue that in this version, if you survive, my guess is that you'll be doing something worth doing. Yeah. In this other case, if you survive, you might have just been able to raise money, or somebody buys you early on. So I think it's okay, but you gotta almost prepare yourself for it. And and to your point, problem discovery and solution probleming are interesting iterative loops. The way I describe it to people is, think of yourself as an insurgent, right? We all know that in every field there's incumbents, and these incumbents innovate in a particular way. They keep expanding what their dominant incumbent zone is ever so gradually. And you come in as an insurgent, you don't have capital as your advantage, you don't have brand as your advantage, you don't have networks as your advantage, but man, you have one advantage, and that is it doesn't matter to you what problem you solve with what solution, as long as you can create value, you make progress. And that's the advantage of an insurgent. What happens is oftentimes people lose that advantage and they force themselves to just do one thing. And I think that insurgent mindset is really, really important.
That's so cool. So say a bit more about the selection pressures that people should put themselves under around their ideas. So the mechanism you talked about is talking to both experts and non-experts, people knowledgeable in the field, but not necessarily deep experts in those fields. What else? What else should they be doing in this early stage where there's some technology, some notion of a problem to be solved, and then some hypothesis or hypotheses that they might have? How do they increase the selection pressure on themselves?
I mean, this is the trickiest part. I should say that when I say experts and non-experts, these can be in academia,
Yes.
these could be in startups, these could be in larger companies. There's a massive amount of networking one has to do so that they get to talk to interesting people who will have a point of view about what they're doing. It is a scary thing to give people your most cherished kind of notion, which you think is the beginnings of the next Apple computer or the next Google, when in fact it's just an idea you had, whatever. So even if the technology has been developed, by the way, companies that are based on a certain technology, either you have patents that cover technology or you don't. If you don't, then you should go file some patents. And if it's truly an invention, and if you say, well, where do I get the money to file the patents? Well, that's a whole course on startup fundraising. But let's assume you've got the ability at least to have patents. So if there are patents, then you don't have to describe the patents and enable people. You just have to say, I've got this patented technology that can do X. And if somebody says, well, how does it work? You can say, look, I'm happy to tell you how it works, but let me first tell you what it does and tell me whether what it does is worth doing. And if they say, but how does it work? There's no logic that says, unless I know how it works, I can't tell you whether what you're proposing to do is worth doing. That's not true. So I think, and the other thing we've learned over the years is how to describe your maybe invention or idea in ways that are analogous to what you're doing, not exactly what you're doing, but that share the effect in common. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
I'm going to invent a digital camera, and I want to find out if cameras underwater are useful. Well, I can take a non-digital camera, and I can say to you, hey, how about this camera underwater? And if they say, well, how's it going to work? It's not digital. And you can say, look, let me just assume I'm doing it. You still don't have to tell them you've got a digital camera. You can give them an analog that has the same problem it's trying to go after, get feedback. Conversely, for problem people, you want to give them a sense of the solution you have and see how they... So it's a little tricky, it may sound a little complicated. Frankly, I think people do this anyway. They just do it out of desperation because they just keep trying and trying and trying and trying. And everything I've said ends up being tried. It's not like we came up with it because I derived it from what I had been doing. It's just that I'm saying be thoughtful about that being the act of... So anyway, I should mention to you in a more kind of abstract way. Years ago, when I started teaching at Sloan this course in 2000, and they wanted me to teach a course on entrepreneurship, and I thought, well, you can't teach entrepreneurship. This is you can maybe learn it, but you can't teach it. And I realized I had this problem with the word entrepreneurship. And I'll tell you to your audience anyway, because I don't want to miss the chance. So first problem with the word entrepreneurship is that any word that's French, is kind of a little bit, ostentatious or whatever. So, there's the old joke, it's the difference between vase and a vase, about $500. So entrepreneur is kind of this. Now, there's an ironic comment I'll make about entrepreneurs, since the audience is an entrepreneur by definition, is that it actually comes from the French word to undertake, which is kind of ironic because that means literally undertaker, which is kind of unfortunately where we find ourselves often as entrepreneurs is you're kind of dealing with undertaking in the other meaning of the word. But the more serious part of what I want to say is this part, which is what I don't like is the ending of the word. So ship as the ending of a word in English often means the state of being something. Craftsmanship, leadership, friendship, sportsmanship, right? All these ships mean the state of being something. Now, I'm an engineer. I don't do engineership.
You do engineering.
I do engineering, which is the act of doing something. And what I really find is an unfortunate remnant of the history of this field is that people are thought to be something versus do something, and therefore they spend all their time trying to analyze the history, the DNA, the character of people who do this, whereas I think at some point people are going to realize that a lot of different kinds of people can do this, but this is entrepreneuring. It's not entrepreneurship. And as soon as society flips that, which is, by the way, happening right around us, all these incubators, mentor services, all these accelerators, all of these are, but when I started 20 years ago, that was not at all in vogue. And we thought,
there's the crazy people who were doing entrepreneurship, or the people that weren't so good at school, right?
Exactly. There were attention deficit, people couldn't get a job. It was kind of a funny field. And then when it succeeded, people celebrated. That's the other thing I'll say is, it's great to celebrate things, but after a while, you got to stop celebrating this because it shouldn't be this rare and it shouldn't be this hard. The reason it is that people often tell themselves, this is like a lottery, it's not going to work, and they do it without a lot of forethought. And that's, I think, why courses like this really should get people to say, I could do it by winging it, but do I want to actually have as my profession improvisation? I mean, if you want to do that, you can be a comedian, you can be a jazz musician, but the notion that you're going to improvise for a living and then take unsuspecting people's money and then let alone make something you put into patients to save them, just think about the juxtaposition of how we do entrepreneurship and what we do in entrepreneurship. Pretty big difference. So I think, I'm very happy that I'm living long enough to see this field literally become a profession. And part of the reason I used to call it parallel entrepreneurship is because it was kind of so ironic. What does it mean to do you can be one thing. How can we be parallel entrepreneurship, right? But once something becomes a profession, I think this is going to be, my kids who are in their 20s now, but the next generation who does this will be more like a profession, like medicine, architecture, versus this sideshow that's celebrated and people are getting movies made and get rich quick scheme. It's going to be a profession.
Two questions for you. Well, first one question for you is around, we're fortunate to be at MIT and Harvard, graduates from those schools and so forth, and our networks are deep and it's easy for us to access people. We just say, I'm an alum from the school or so forth. Others aren't from those schools. How do they build networks? How do they access networks when they may not have the brand labels attached to them?
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, brand labels are one thing. Physical location is one thing. Look, there's no. I don't have a special insight to that. I recognize that is. Not doing it isn't a possibility here, but figuring out how to do it. I think it's at the end of the day, relationships lead to relationships, and being connected wherever you are, being connected to some thought leaders. First of all, I'd say that around the world, people who are the top in their field are both have other colleagues in that field, but also are recognized for being top in their field and therefore can open doors to any other field. So I would look for somebody who's top in a field, even though that's not what I'm working on, and see if I can develop a relationship through whom I can get some credibility to be able to break into this. If you can actually go to a place where there's people who have expertise, it's really a question of just persistence. I don't know of some magic way of doing it. There's people who are great networkers. I'm not one of them, by the way. So I whatever success I've had has been despite that. Took me a long time to even say hello to David Packard 30 some years ago. It's just not. But other people. So the other thing you got to do, and it's just a good segue, is look. You're not doing this alone. And so part of the reason to have an early team is that there'll be other personalities. And so if you're not that, but there is somebody who's that, their value is immense, provided that they're not sitting there saying, oh, what's the product, what's the science? And they may be out saying, how do I create relationships so that we can actually get the idea exposed, gets feedback? By the way, and I said earlier, the more you make yourself needy and accepting of their input, the more they'll be willing to do it. It's what I've seen. So don't go in there and make pronouncements and kind of say, we've solved this problem. I've long thought that this whole culture of 30-second elevator pitches and quick business plans and value propositions and executive summaries juxtaposed to something that's completely unprecedented, I'm sorry, it's laughable. Because somebody, it's cute, but then somebody really just wants to say, what's the big idea, and why do you think you can work on this, and why you, why this, why now? Those are the three questions. And if you just get people to say, look, I don't know exactly how I'm going to do this, so stay a little vulnerable.
Especially the early stage, right?
Exactly. And even later on, look, you're always the earlier stage of what you want to become. So I actually would advise not to become later stage. I think you want to stay early stage. Moderna is an early stage company. Moderna wants to have 10 drugs in 10 different therapeutic areas 10 years from now. So what is it compared to that? Nothing. Early stage. That keeps you in that mode of constantly looking up versus saying, wow, look how far I got. I must know something. The worst thing you could do is to think you look down the mountain and say, I must know how to climb because look at where I am. Bad idea.
Let's just talk about your view about the systematic nature of innovation and how it can be systematized. What advice, again, would you give to our course participants around how to flip their mind away from the lottery perspective to the systematic perspective? Like, how should they reorient their own thinking around the systematic nature?
Yeah, no, I mean, look, I think it's tricky, right? Because every other input and impetus we get about entrepreneurship reinforces the lottery mentality. There's television shows, there's this, that, and people, frankly, I hate it because people also describe their success story
as a lottery
in that way. It's literally like saying, I can dunk because I'm 7'8". Well, what am I supposed to do with that, right? It often isn't true, but in any case, people describe it as this fantasy. By the way, parenthetically, I'll mention one thing just because some may resonate with some people. Any journey in hindsight can be described in a very different way than it was actually prosecuted. As a good example of that is if you think a chess game. In the beginning, there's a massive range of things you could do. At the very end, there's only a few things you could do. And if you look at the game backwards, the game looks entirely different. Every decision you take now informs your interpretation of how you made that decision, which is not how you made the decision. That is why a lot of people tell entrepreneurship, or for that matter, innovation journeys, not accurately at all, because that they don't describe it the way they were thinking about it. So that's just a thought. So your question about how do they think more systematically about it? Again, I would say, keep an adaptive evolutionary mindset. Try this kind of variation selection. You might ask, how long do you iterate? Because if you keep iterating forever, you're never going to do anything. So there's this kind of difference between what's possible and what's real, and kind of you got to extract some reality out of it. But I think it isn't. I don't have kind of rules of thumb. I'd say don't get trapped into thinking that all you need to do is to find a base use case for something that exists. You can do that. By the way, if you go through all of this and you find that the first thing you thought of is the most valuable thing, great. You'll be well served, because if it turns out not to be, you have other things to do. So it was not a waste of time. But if you think your job is to find that one thing, as though there is one thing, that's where you get into the lottery trap. I long ago, this will kind of maybe revolt people to hear me say it, but I hope they take it with a bit of a grain of salt. Long ago, somebody, when I first came to MIT, used to use the expression that the lottery is a tax on the mathematically impaired.
Yes.
And if you just stop and think about it, in reality, there's no version of a lottery that makes any, and yet we do it because we're human beings and we're optimists and we think that we can beat the odds. There's an element of a lottery that's always going to be there with startups. An element, what I call a leap of faith. Right? There's a leap of faith which says, I can reason my way to this point. I want to do something that's a little further or a lot further. I have to leap. That we're never going to take away. I'm not advocating that because that's contrary to my reasonableness discussion before. However, when you say, well, it's a lottery anyway, so why not buy 10 tickets? Why not buy, get all my earnings and put it into the lottery? That level of kind of, trying to rationalize that there's some, that's dangerous. And I think this field, a lot of failures, you've probably studied this a lot better than I have, but a lot of failures in startups, I think, are avoidable, and some are not. Now we report on the data on both. And I think over time, the first category should diminish. The other has to do with uncertainty and competition and all sorts of things we're not going to get away from.